Welcome to the debate. We are immediately turning our attention to the high north, where an unprecedented geopolitical maneuver is unfolding in the Arctic theater concerning Greenland. The strategic stakes are immense, and they're being driven by twin threats: the intensifying influence of Russia and China, and, critically, the internal fracturing caused by the U.S. president's unilateral claims over the territory.
And this is really a crisis of political leverage, all centered on a strategically vital island. The catalyst, as current intelligence indicates, was in fact the U.S. president's threat to claim ownership of Greenland. And this was predicated on what was framed as overwhelming security requirements. This immediately placed Denmark, the sovereign power, and a key NATO ally in an impossible bind.
The response from allied capitals is what truly defines this moment. We are seeing high-level, urgent talks led by the UK alongside Germany and France, planning a significant NATO military mission. And this is not just signaling. This involves the planned deployment of UK soldiers, warships, and aircraft to the island.
And the tension lies in the duality of the plan's goals, doesn't it? I mean, the stated objective is classic great power competition: to protect Greenland from Russia and China. But the underlying and far more precarious strategic goal is to establish a clear, immediate NATO military presence that's really intended to neutralize the U.S. president's annexation ambitions and deny the political justification for U.S. intervention.
And we absolutely cannot discuss this without acknowledging the profound complication for Copenhagen. Greenland is actively advancing toward independence. So any action taken now, whether it's military or political, risks alienating the local population and further accelerating that process, which complicates any long-term NATO strategic foothold.
Absolutely. Which I think means our central question today has to be, is this NATO military action a necessary operational stabilizer for the Arctic, or is it a profound political gamble that risks alliance fracture by using hard power to address what is, I think, a fundamentally soft power dilemma?
I hold a position that physical, immediate, military action is the necessary response. When sovereignty is threatened, and when credible external threats, specifically the Russian resurgence of A2AD capabilities in the high north, are palpable, tangible deterrence must precede diplomacy. My thesis is that operational necessity simply trumps political risk here. Current intelligence supports the UP Prime Minister Keir Starmer's assessment that Russian and Chinese strategic influence in the region is, quote, extremely serious.
I don't disagree with the assessment of the external threat, but I approach the solution from a different angle. Attempting to address a political crisis, one driven by a NATO leader, through a reactive military deployment, it just seems like an inherently flawed strategy that raises the political costs exponentially. It could even trigger the very fragmentation we're trying to avoid.
But the proposed deployment, and we're talking naval assets, aircraft, it provides immediate, tangible deterrence against external actors, while simultaneously denying the U.S. the pretextual security vacuum. Specifically, the UK is establishing crucial anti-submarine warfare, or ASW, denial zones in the extended GI-UK gap. This is about establishing operational fact on the ground, or in this case, on the sea and the ice. Political statements have failed. Only a demonstrable, unified NATO commitment on the terrain can shift the calculus.
I would argue that your focus on tactical gains, it obscures the far greater political mechanisms at play. The core issue here is political leverage and alliance cohesion, not a deficiency in deployed hardware. The actual strategic levers available to Europe are economic and political. And believe me, they hit a lot harder than any limited naval deployment.
Which are purely theoretical.
Oh, they are anything but. The European Union is reportedly drafting plans to sanction U.S. companies, which would be a severe economic hit, but the ultimate deterrent is the threat of expelling U.S. military forces from strategic bases in Europe. We are talking about critical logistics hubs like Ramstein, which are essential not for Arctic operations, but for U.S. power projection across the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. This action targets the global foundation of U.S. strategy. So you see, The military deployment is a concession, whereas the threat of base expulsion leverages long-term U.S. interests against its short-term ambitions in Greenland.
That's a compelling argument regarding leverage, I'll grant you. But have you considered the speed differential? The central operational challenge to your soft power perspective is this. How does a limited allied force physically defend the island against a potential threat from the alliance leader, the U.S., without risking open conflict? And, more importantly, can the EU bureaucracy mobilize sanctions or base revocations faster than a motivated U.S. president can declare a fait accompli and send in a Marine expeditionary unit?
The answer is that the military deployment has symbolic value against the U.S., but it has negligible operational deterrence. Its true purpose is to address the Russian and Chinese threat while providing some political cover. But let's move into the core debate on sustainability.
Let's focus on the logistics of resolve. The deployment, while limited, is a concrete sign of political commitment, and it forces NATO to establish cold weather infrastructure and operational familiarity in the high north now. The U.S. threat was explicitly predicated on a security justification. Well, this deployment removes that justification by filling the perceived gap themselves. We are denying the strategic pretext.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because sustainability is the fundamental operational issue. That hardware, the warships, the ISR aircraft, it's impressive. But can the UK and its partners sustain the supply chain for it in the harsh Arctic environment without full, active U.S. logistical cooperation? They would immediately face astronomical costs and, frankly, operational vulnerabilities.
They can sustain it long enough to make the political point, which is the immediate requirement.
But for how long? I mean, we're talking about specialized, ice-capable logistics, deep-sea fueling, long-range air support, all areas where the UK and its partners rely heavily on the existing U.S. infrastructure at Thule Air Base and elsewhere. If the U.S. withdraws cooperation, this deployment becomes a tactical albatross. It'll just consume vast resources simply to survive. It risks transforming the deployed force from a shield into a logistical liability. And this brings us to the efficacy of the respective tools. Your military deployment, it addresses the symptom, insecurity, but it ignores the cause, which is U.S. unilateralism. The EU's countermeasure threats, they strike directly at core U.S. global strategic interests. You mentioned the speed of bureaucracy, but once enacted, sanctions targeting major U.S. defense contractors or tech firms with a significant EU presence would cause immediate, measurable economic damage far exceeding the cost of any Arctic operation. So why commit highly visible military forces to a vulnerable Arctic position when a targeted political economic lever is sharper, less risky, and hits harder?
I respectfully disagree with the premise that economic threats are sufficient leverage here. Political threats are only credible if they are backed by the capability to secure the prize in question. If Washington believes the Allies are only capable of economic warfare, they might just dismiss them as paper tigers in a region as strategically vital as the Arctic. The NATO deployment ensures that if diplomacy fails, the Allies are not negotiating from a position of strategic weakness. Furthermore, this dual-track approach, this military deployment under the guise of anti-Russian measures, it allows the UK and others to genuinely address the external threat, regardless of the US political cycle. It gives Europe plausible deniability that the operation is purely anti-US, maintaining the fragile fiction of alliance unity.
Let's pivot, because the most critical pivot point in this entire crisis is the future of Greenland itself. The long-term strategic cost of this hard power maneuver is the dilemma it poses for Denmark. It's pushing Greenland further toward independence. If NATO forces its presence, especially in the face of local political resistance, it risks alienating the population. And we can't forget, Greenland holds strategically valuable rare earth minerals, and its pathway to independence is exactly where Russia and China are looking to deepen their investments.
We have to lock down the ground now. Diplomacy comes later. Our actions today must prevent a security crisis. Failure to act now sends a dangerous signal of weakness, not only to U.S. leadership, but certainly to external competitors. This targeted reinforcement of NATO's northern flank strengthens the alliance's defensive posture as a whole.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the risk differently. This action risks making Greenland a strategic flashpoint between NATO members. If the US rejects the deployment offer and Europe responds with the extreme option of stripping the US of strategic bases, think Ramstein, think critical logistics hubs, that is a catastrophic, overt strategic fragmentation. We could be talking about NATO ships facing NATO ships, or, at the very least, a fundamental breach of trust.
But that risk is political, not military.
Precisely. And we must remember that winning the battle in Greenland doesn't mean winning the war for NATO unity. If NATO loses its political cohesion over a territorial dispute driven by one member's unilateralism, the long-term impact on global security outweighs any short-term gain in the Arctic. We risk what I would call a Suez of the North.
Explain that analogy for our listeners.
1956 was a momentary tactical alliance between the UK, France, and Israel against Egypt. They achieved a local military success, but the political humiliation when the US undermined them, forcing their withdrawal through massive economic pressure, it caused an irreparable rift in the underlying political trust. It shifted the global balance of power for a generation. A Suez of the North means that even if Europe succeeds in forcing the US president to back down, the very act of confronting a core ally with military force and economic threats causes permanent political humiliation and fracture, leaving the alliance strategically weakened globally, regardless of who secures the Arctic.
A powerful analogy that certainly defines the scope of the risk. However, to summarize my position, rapid, tactical deterrence and physical consolidation of defense are non-negotiable. The geopolitical reality is that we must have capability on the ground to secure the terrain before any high-stakes political maneuvering can succeed. We have to deny the vacuum.
And I reaffirm that the alliance must utilize its most powerful diplomatic and economic levers to manage the profound political crisis this event represents. It has to prioritize long-term cohesion and global leverage over a short-term, risky military posture in an incredibly difficult operating environment where, let's be honest, we lack the logistical independence to truly prevail without U.S. cooperation.
So how does this profound tension play out in the near future? Let's consider the scenarios for the next 6 months, beginning with, I suppose, the best-case outcome.
Scenario A. Best case. The offer of NATO deployment is accepted by Washington, perhaps reluctantly, but publicly, as a sufficient security guarantee. The situation de-escalates. The deployment proceeds with U.S. tacit backing, strengthening the Arctic defense against Russia and China. This allows the U.S. president a political win on securing Greenland without the territorial acquisition, and NATO avoids that overt internal fragmentation.
That requires a lot of coordination and, frankly, intellectual honesty from all parties. Now, the flip side. Scenario B. Worst case, the U.S. president rejects the deployment offer outright, maybe viewing it as an encroachment on U.S. strategic space. The EU, having drawn its red line, immediately activates the most extreme leverage options, specifically base expulsions, forcing the immediate transfer of U.S. assets out of Europe. This leads to a severe, overt, and likely irreparable fracture within NATO, forcing member states to choose between Washington and Brussels. It would fundamentally alter the post-war global security architecture.
I believe the most politically mature actors are likely trying to avoid those extremes, which leads to scenario C, most likely case. Negotiations stall, they just stay in a perpetual holding pattern, much like previous trade standoffs. Deployment plans remain in a preparation status indefinitely, providing a political buffer without committing forces to the field. The U.S. maintains the threat of annexation, while Europe maintains the sanction and base expulsion threats. The immediate focus then shifts away from the US-NATO dynamic and toward managing Denmark's political challenges with Greenland's growing independence movement, which becomes a long-term strategic headache for the alliance, constantly susceptible to non-NATO influence.
Which means the key battleground shifts from the military theater to the political halls of Nuuk and Copenhagen, where adversaries can exert influence through economic means without ever firing a shot.
And so the question remains whether this crisis over Greenland will ultimately be solved by the physical presence of military hardware denying a security vacuum, or by the complex, high-stakes diplomacy of strategic interest and alliance leverage. We will continue to follow the situation closely. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.